So it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Peter Annin. A veteran conflict and environmental journalist, Peter Annin spent more than a decade reporting on a wide variety of issues for Newsweek. For many years, he specialized in coverage of domestic terrorism and other conflicts, including the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City and the Branch Davidian standoff outside Waco, Texas. He also spent many years writing about the environment, including drought in the Southwest, hurricanes in the Southeast, wind power on the Great Plains, and causes and consequences of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. After Newsweek, Annin became Associate Director of the Institutes for Journalism and Natural Resources, which is a nonpartisan national nonprofit that organizes in educational fellowships for mid-career environmental journalists. In 2006, he published his first book, The Great Lakes Water Wars, which has been called the definitive work of the Great Lakes water diversion controversy, and received the Great Lakes Book Award for nonfiction. From 2010 to 2015, Annin served as managing director of the University of Notre Dame's Environmental Change Initiative, which targets the interrelated problems of invasive species, land use, and climate change, focusing on their synergistic impacts on water resources. He currently serves as director of the Mary Giggs Burke Center for Freshwater Innovation at Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin. He has a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Wisconsin and a master's in international affairs from Columbia University in New York. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone. I start my talks with an audience poll, just a quick stand-up, sit-down thing that helps me gauge the Great Lakes-ness of my audience before I begin my remarks. And we're in a Great Lakes state, but we're outside the Great Lakes watershed, so this is going to be really interesting. So everybody stand up. This is the easy one. You'll see where I'm headed. If you've visited at least one North American Great Lake, should be most of you in the state of Minnesota. Remain standing if you visited 2 North American Great Lakes, 3, 4, and all 5. We're a long way from Lake Ontario. Okay, we're not done. Stand if you have immersed yourself in at least one North American Great Lake. Accidental or intentional, doesn't matter. Remain standing if you have immersed yourself in 2 North American Great Lakes, 3, 4, and all 5. These are the diehards. Will you join me in recognizing them with a round of applause? Yeah. That's good. Okay, so we have a lot of content to get through today, and this is we'll just hop right to it. So the thesis of my talk today and my book is that the Great Lakes region, the North American continent, and the entire world are all entering a period of increased water tension. Those tensions are primarily driven by water scarcity, and they're expected to put increased pressure on water-rich regions of the world, like the North American Great Lakes. Consequently, there's been a collective agreement among water thought leaders in the Great Lakes region that the region needs a modern, binding, world-class water management system to protect this globally significant resource that we have in the Great Lakes as we enter a period of increasing international water insecurity. And that is the Great Lakes Compact, which bans diversions from the Great Lakes watershed, which we'll talk about at great length later. But first, let's review the global water picture, which is grim and predicted to get grimmer. Yes, there's a lot of water in the grade school globe, but only 1% of that water is accessible, drinkable, fresh water, just 1%. 800 million people around the world today lack access to clean drinking water. 1,000 children, according to the UN, die daily from unhealthy water conditions around the world. Water demand is expected to surge by more than 50% by mid-century. And according to the UN, 2/3 of the global population will be water stressed by the year 2025. In my opinion, the most egregious example of water mismanagement on the face of the earth has occurred in the Aral Sea watershed In Central Asia, not a very well-known part of the world here in the United States, but you can see we're just north of Iran and Afghanistan there, sandwiched between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The Aral Sea was once the fourth largest inland water body in the world, roughly Lake Huron-esque in size. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union, which controlled this part of the world at the time, embarked on a massive collective agricultural irrigation scheme, not tapping into the Aral Sea, which is a naturally brackish system, but to the large freshwater rivers that fed the Aral Sea. And they sent that fresh water through a series of irrigation canals and pipes to make the desert bloom. And the desert did bloom, but at great cost to the Aral Sea's ecosystem. This is a photo I took of the bottom of the Aral Sea when I traveled there with a delegation from the Russian Academy of Sciences several years ago. In 1960, there was 45, 50 feet of water here, a teeming warm water fishery, fishing trawlers passing overhead, ferry boats taking people from Kazakhstan to Uzbekistan. Today, as far as the eye can see, all directions of the compass, no water. It was a Great Lakes guy. It was a very chilling place to visit. This series of satellite photos shows the decline of the Aral Sea over the last 40, 50 years or so. And the Aral Sea has lost 96% of its volume and 90% of its surface area since the 1960s. And so I have a chapter on the Aral Sea in my book about the Great Lakes water diversion controversy, not because I am alleging that this is what's going to happen to the Great Lakes, but as a journalist writing about the Great Lakes water diversion controversy, almost every person that I interviewed, whether it was a politician, a natural resource manager, a scientist, environmental advocate, an attorney, would refer to the Aral Sea as this touchstone, this nightmare example of what could happen if we have a mismanagement of Great Lakes water. And yet, to a person, none of them had been to the Aral Sea. So I decided if this Aral Sea place is this touchstone for the Great Lakes region, that I'd go there in one short chapter, write the story about what happened in the Aral Sea, and then leave it up to the citizens of the Great Lakes region to decide for themselves what the relevance is between the Aral Sea situation and the Great Lakes water diversion controversy here. I did bring back one key take-home message from my visit to the Aral Sea, however. Having seen what happened there essentially in my lifetime, I don't think a person can stand on the shore of a North American Great Lake or a Great Lake anywhere and argue that it is so vast that it's invincible. What the Aral Sea situation shows that despite the magnitude of these charismatic water bodies, they are fragile, and we need to keep that in mind when we make water management decisions. Okay, that was a quick global look at the water situation. Now we're zeroing in on the North American continent, specifically with this map, the lower western 48 states. This map is published by the U.S. Department of Interior, our own federal government, predicting potential water supply crisis areas by the year 2025. Classic color coding scheme for those of you in the back. Yellow with the conflict potential is moderate, orange substantial, red highly likely. The only state on this map that doesn't have color coding on it is the state of South Dakota. All the other states in the lower western 48, according to our own federal government, have at least a moderate potential for water supply conflict by year 2025. And you can see there's a lot of orange and red on this map. And yes, so we do have issues in the lower western 48, but we also have issues elsewhere. All these red circles, I'm not going to go into detail here, but we can talk about it during Q&A if you want, show water tension hot spots. Some are hotter than others, like the Colorado River is hotter than the Ipswich River outside of Boston. But if you look at these red circles from the perspective of the Great Lakes watershed, those red circles represent an arc of water tension on the south side of the Great Lakes Basin. And it's this arc of water tension that tends to drive the Great Lakes water diversion debate, sometimes accurately and sometimes inaccurately. And there is a lot of paranoia driving the Great Lakes water diversion debate because there's a lot of water tension surrounding the Great Lakes region. The other thing that drives the Great Lakes water diversion debate is proposals like this one. The Grand Canal proposed distribution system from the 1960s. This is a Canadian proposal. Tom Kieran's a Canadian engineer who passed away a few years ago. Delightful man, fascinating interview for the book. And he was concerned about the global water crisis, the continental water crisis, so he hatches this plan in the early 1960s. Look up at James Bay there, southeast corner of Hudson Bay, to put a large dam across James Bay over time allow the large Arctic streams there to turn James Bay from a saltwater system to a freshwater system, then canal that water down into northern Lake Huron, making the flow out of Lake Superior superfluous. So we're going to take that flow and send it west to the Canadian prairies, but ultimately down to the southwest. And then we have NWAPA, an American version, North American Water and Power Alliance, occurring around the same time. They're actually competing plans to replumb the North American continent, a Canadian one and an American one. But it was the Grand Canal proposal that was most alarming in the Great Lakes region. And both NWAPA and the Grand Canal had influential supporters at the time. They also had a lot of controversy and opponents. These were incredibly costly proposals. They're sort of like the heyday of the dam building and water infrastructure eras that started, back with Hoover Dam and others. And so, but this also is a period of rising environmental consciousness in North America. Leopold's out in Sand County Almanac, published in 48 or so, and so we have Silent Spring, Rachel Carson, and so these plans eventually fell under their environmental weight, their financial weight, but the fear in the Great Lakes region is that under some future water crisis scenario, these plans would be dusted off and versions of them might be revived or proposed by influential people. Okay, so we had a global water picture, we had a continental water picture, now zeroing in on my favorite part, the Great Lakes watershed itself. If you see here, you see the 5 Great Lakes, then you have this green kind of aqua shading around it. That's the Great Lakes watershed. And I probably don't need to talk about what a watershed is to this group. But normally I refer to it as a soup bowl rim, and rainfall, snowfall, groundwater recharge that occurs within that soup bowl rim is the key to water sustainability in the Great Lakes region. Look, if you will, how far the gap is between the shoreline and the watershed line in some parts of the Great Lakes Basin, and then how remarkably narrow, truly remarkably narrow, a lot of water people in here, how narrow the gap is between the shoreline and the watershed line in other parts of the Great Lakes Basin. It's these areas where the shoreline is closest to the watershed line where water tension in the Great Lakes region is highest, and yes, despite the abundance, there is a lot of water tension in the Great Lakes region, which we'll talk about more in a minute. But first, some really cool Great Lakes facts. 20%, 1/5 of all the fresh surface water on the planet is in the Great Lakes watershed. That's enough water to cover the lower 48 states in nearly 10 feet of water. Remarkable statistic. The key statistic today, and there won't be many, because I'm a journalist, not a scientist, is that only 1% of the water in the Great Lakes Basin is renewed annually through rainfall, snowfall, and groundwater recharge, just 1%. So think of the Great Lakes as a gift from the glaciers, deposited in the heart of the North American continent 10,000 years ago. This water bank account that has this 1% of water interest that flows through that bank account on an annual basis. And the key is that we don't want to be consuming more than our 1% of water interest annually and tapping into the principle of our water bank account. Scientists assure me we're not even close to consuming that 1%, but we don't have a great binational handle on just how much of that 1% we are consuming as we leave what I call the century of oil and we enter the century of water. And by that I don't mean that cars are going to run on water in the future, but in my opinion, water will replace petroleum as the defining global natural resource by the end of the century, and places like the Great Lakes region have to have a really good baseline handle on their water consumption, water use as we enter the century of water. 35 million people in the US and Canada, billions of creatures in a really unique cold water ecosystem here in the Great Lakes region. This is not very well known. The regional economy, the 8 Great Lakes states from Minnesota to New York, provinces of Ontario and Quebec, make up the 3rd largest economy in the world, nearly $6 trillion, and much, though not all, of that economy is water dependent. Okay, so there's that same basin map with a bunch of orange triangles on it. These triangles represent all the human poking and prodding that has occurred within the Great Lakes watershed during the last 200 years or so, and there's a lot. Each arrow triangle represents a water diversion that already exists in the Great Lakes region. Some of the arrows are big because the diversions are big. Some of them are small because they're small. Some of them are pointed in because they're givers, and some of them are headed out because they're takers. According to the International Joint Commission, which is a body formed by the federal governments of the United States and Canada in 1909 under a treaty to resolve transboundary water disputes all along the U.S.-Canada border, not just in the Great Lakes. According to the IJC, there have been 8 inter-basin diversions. Those are diversions that actually pierce the watershed line or the soup bowl rim. And there have been 6 intra-basin diversions. Those are diversions that artificially transport water from one Great Lake to another within the watershed, such as the Welland Canal, bypassing Niagara Falls, allowing saltwater shipping vessels to reach ports like Chicago, Duluth being the largest port in the Great Lakes region. The biggest and most controversial Great Lakes water diversion of them all, at least sending water outside the Great Lakes watershed, is the Illinois diversion in Chicago from 1900. Why is this here? Go back to the late 1800s, 1870s, the Great Chicago Fire torches much of the downtown area. The city embarks on this massive effort to rebuild itself, becomes this booming metropolis of 1 million people out on the prairie, growing leaps and bounds. The water infrastructure in the city can't keep up with the growth, unregulated outhouses throughout the city, anecdotal evidence of sewage running through the streets. This is not a great lunch conversation. I'm sorry about that. And then we have these massive stockyards, hard to imagine today, on the south side of town. Thousands and thousands of animals. The waste from those animals while they're waiting to be slaughtered, slaughterhouse waste running into the Chicago River, anecdotal evidence of the river running red with blood. Then big summer storm events flushes all this filth out into Lake Michigan. Boat captains and fishermen come to the wharves in downtown Chicago with alarm on their faces, talking about this gigantic, grotesque sewage slick that is far out in Lake Michigan, getting close to the city's water intake structures, which are still visible today, 2 miles off the shore. So the city was concerned that its unsustainable water management practices was on the brink of polluting its drinking water supply. So it embarks on this massive Panama Canal-like engineering project to reverse the flow of the Chicago River, connect it to this 26, 28-mile canal, and send Lake Michigan water and all that filth into the Chicago Sanitary Ship Canal, which then dumps into the Des Plaines River, dumps into the Illinois River, and ultimately the Mississippi River. So Chicago's plan was to flush its toilet to St. Louis. Not popular in Missouri, so Missouri challenges the canal and goes to the Supreme Court, and to completely oversimplify a long, drawn-out Supreme Court case, the justices heard testimony that all sorts of people dumped sewage upstream of St. Louis in the Mississippi River, and they couldn't tell whose sewage was whose, so they let Illinois off the hook. That spawned a century of litigation over this controversial water diversion plan, which still rules over the Illinois diversion today. In 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court set the limit of this water diversion at 2.1 billion gallons per day. So 2.1 billion gallons of Great Lakes water flows to the Gulf of Mexico through metropolitan Chicago every day. According to the International Joint Commission, this one diversion lowered water levels on Lakes Michigan and Huron by 2.5 inches. 2.5 inches doesn't sound like that much, but I live in Lake Superior, the largest lake by surface area in the world. Michigan and Huron, hydrologically speaking, are one lake, and they are the largest lake in the world. And so this one diversion lowers water levels on the largest lake in the world by 2.5 inches. And inches matter, believe it or not, in the Great Lakes region. 2013, just 6 short years ago, Michigan and Huron broke an all-time record low. And especially during, we have high water now, but especially during low water periods, iron ore freighters, 1,000-footers, taking iron ore from the Iron Range to the steel mills in Chicago and northern Ohio. During these low water periods, they have to take out a corresponding amount from their hold so that they can get through the shallow connecting channels in the Great Lakes Basin. Well, this isn't just an environmental issue, it's also an economic issue in the Great Lakes region. So today, this is seen as what we don't want to have happen anymore in the Great Lakes region. On the other hand, metropolitan Chicago does not have great groundwater, doesn't have a great groundwater system, and if it weren't for this diversion, one could make the case that Chicago would not be the global city it is today if it weren't for this water diversion. Therein lie the trade-offs in the water diversion debate in the Great Lakes region. Okay, so that's a controversial U.S. water diversion at the beginning of the last century. Now we have a controversial Canadian water diversion proposal at the end of the last century. The Nova Group, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, a relatively unknown consulting firm in Sault Ste. Marie hatches a plan to send tankers of pristine Lake Superior water to Asia, 158 million gallons per year. Sort of Fiji water in reverse, if you will. Could not be stopped by anti-diversion laws in the United States. Actually, it could have been stopped if it was in the United States. Laws in the US could have stopped it, but US laws don't work in Canada. Couldn't be stopped by Canadian laws. So by the time the NOVA proposal became public, they had already received a permit from the province of Ontario. Became very alarming to politicians, environmental advocates, average citizens throughout the Great Lakes region. You had politicians on both sides of the international border grandstanding and press conferences and talk shows in opposition to the NOVA proposal, not because 158 million gallons per year is going to harm Lake Superior. With whatever it is, 3 quadrillion gallons in Lake Superior, you can't even measure 158 million gallons. Well, you probably could, but it would be so minuscule. The issue was legal. The issue was about legal precedent. And the lawyers had always told the governors and premiers in the Great Lakes region that you don't want to set a precedent for sending water outside the Great Lakes watershed, even just a little bit, like 10 miles. Because if someone then comes 50 miles out and you set this precedent for 10 miles out, how do you say no? And then that could lead to 100 or 500, and then the next thing you know, you'd have this yellow brick canal to Las Vegas or wherever. And the lawyers said to the governors and premiers, you gave this company a permit, and it's diverting water all the way to Asia. And if you can divert Great Lakes water to Asia, where can't you divert it? And therein lay the controversy at the time. The NOVA Group was completely caught off guard by the controversy. They agreed to withdraw their permit, but nevertheless, the situation highlighted the weakness in the water management policy in the Great Lakes region at the time. So it is the NOVA proposal in 1998 that leads to the Great Lakes Compact in 2005. Released in Milwaukee, December 13th, 2005. At this moment, it's just a piece of paper. For a compact to go into force and have the force of law, it needs to be adopted by all relevant states. So all 8 state legislatures from Minnesota to New York have to adopt it first. Then it goes to Congress. Then it has to be signed by the president. High hurdle. To the surprise of many of us, the compact sailed through the Great Lakes legislatures in 3 years, cruised through Capitol Hill in 2 months. The Great Lakes congressional delegation was absolutely poised and ready to receive it if the states could get it to Washington. President Bush signs it in October of 2008. So we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Great Lakes Compact a year ago this month. And then Ontario adopted a companion agreement to the Great Lakes Compact in 2007, Quebec in 2009. Today, the Great Lakes Compact is seen as this remarkable bipartisan agreement adopted on behalf of future generations in the absence of a crisis. How often do you hear those words strung together anymore? It's also seen as a global model for international transboundary water management. Okay, let's get into the weeds just a little bit. The Great Lakes Compact, what does it do? The Great Lakes Compact is a ban on diversions with limited exceptions. Those limited exceptions are for straddling communities that sit right on top of the edge of the watershed line, partially inside the Great Lakes watershed, partially outside the Great Lakes watershed. If they have a public water supply problem, they have a right to apply for a Great Lakes water diversion just to the other side of town that's outside the Great Lakes watershed, and then clean that water to Clean Water Act standards and send it back to the Great Lakes. Straddling community applications only need the approval of the local governor. Then there's the straddling county exception clause, which is more controversial and more complicated. Straddling county, and this is a map of southeastern Wisconsin here with examples, real examples actually, of straddling community and straddling county applications. So we have Waukesha County here. You can see the green dotted line is the edge of the watershed. And the county straddles the Great Lakes Basin line, and the community that's in a straddling county can also apply for a limited Great Lakes water diversion. But a straddling county application requires the approval of all 8 Great Lakes governors from Minnesota to New York. And so what happens, and we have these requirements for these straddling communities, what happens when they apply, or in order to apply, They have to agree, A, to return the water after it's used, so there's no net loss to the system after an allocation for a little bit of consumptive use. They have to have a strict water conservation plan because the governors don't want to allow a diversion to a community that's going to waste the water. They also have to show that they have no reasonable water supply alternatives. That basically, Great Lakes water is essentially a last resort. They would also have to prove that there would be no adverse environmental impacts if this water diversion were in fact approved. So in 2010, we had the first major test case of the Great Lakes Compact. Waukesha, Wisconsin, outside of Milwaukee, 70,000 people, is in that county that I showed you. It's a straddling county application. And so it sits on top of a depleted and contaminated aquifer, has a long history of problems. It's under state and federal pressure to find an alternate water source for its people. It submits this application, immediately becomes very controversial. 11,000 comments pour in from throughout the Great Lakes Basin, not just Wisconsin, and the vast majority of them are opposed. And so, again, the key hurdle for a straddling county applicant is that Waukesha's water diversion required the approval of all 8 Great Lakes governors. It applied for 10 million gallons per day in 2010. Because it's the first test case ever of the Great Lakes Compact at this level, the Wisconsin DNR takes 5 years to review the application, which balloons to 3,000 pages. They finally decide it's ready to circulate with the other governors. January of 2016, it goes through a 6-month review from the other Great Lakes governors. The provincial premiers have a voice, but not a vote, over water diversion applications in the United States, just like governors have a voice, but not a vote over water diversion applications in the provinces of Ontario and Quebec. Miraculously, whether you liked it or not, it was a historic vote. And the governors unanimously approved Waukesha's water diversion. Again, all it takes is one no vote, one veto, and Waukesha's out of luck. The Governor Dayton of Minnesota left all of us in suspense literally to the last minute on the vote. Nobody knew which way they were going. Many others had showed their cards. But the decision came only after the governors required Waukesha to reduce their water supply service area by more than 50%. They wanted the area in gold. They got the area in blue, which is basically their existing service area today. Waukesha, and then the governors also reduced the amount of the diversion from 10 million gallons per day to a little bit over 8 million gallons per day. And Waukesha agreed to return 100% of the water, which was a PR move on their part. Again, the compact requires the water be returned, but allows an allowance for consumptive use. So Waukesha, to increase support, which was tough because of the controversy, agreed to return 100% of the water, so actually sending back some Mississippi River watershed water to make it literally no net loss. And so this Waukesha application, been a lot of controversy and confusion, but it does not set precedent for long-range, large-scale water diversions outside of the Great Lakes Basin. Those are not possible anymore under the Great Lakes Compact. It just sets precedent for future straddling county water diversion applicants. Nevertheless, the mayors in the Great Lakes region were adamantly opposed to the Waukesha application. They appealed the decision. The appeals go to the governor under the Great Lakes Compact. The governors listened to the appeal and rejected the appeal. So then for months, it looked like the Great Lakes governors were going to square off in federal court with the Great Lakes mayors over the first test case of the Great Lakes Compact. Very tense for a while. In the end, the mayors backed off and settled out of court. Nevertheless, there's still a lot of controversy about the Waukesha water diversion application. Then, surprising all of us, especially an author who was wrapping up a manuscript, heading to the publisher, the second edition of the book, Foxconn, the 27th largest company in the world, announces plans to build a massive facility in southeastern Wisconsin, in that area that I was showing you earlier, that's the size of 3 Pentagons, a liquid crystal display factory that could employ up to 13,000 people. Lured to Wisconsin because of its abundant water resources, but also because of billions of dollars in incentives from the state and some local governments. The fascinating thing is they picked the site for their corporate campus that straddled the Great Lakes Basin line. We have straddling counties, we have straddling communities, and now we have a straddling corporate campus. I called up the DNR and said, really? And they said, we told them. And so So they need, this is an area with not great groundwater, so they need a water diversion. Corporations can't apply for a water diversion under the compact. Communities have to apply. This is a straddling community application. And so this is the picture, architectural rendering that Foxconn released in Wisconsin last summer. And I intentionally left people back there in the background for scale. It's a huge architectural model. The plant is the larger white buildings in the lower left-hand corner, then supply chain up above, and then some residential properties to the right. And I had a graphic designer just roughly overlay the Great Lakes watershed line and to show how it cuts right through the corporate campus. As I said, corporations can't apply for a water diversion, only communities can. The Foxconn plant is in the community of Mount Pleasant. Mount Pleasant doesn't have its own water supply utility. It gets its water from Racine, Wisconsin. So Racine, Wisconsin submits the water diversion application on behalf of Mount Pleasant, which is submitting it on behalf primarily for Foxconn. Becomes controversial again. The request is for 7 million gallons per day. The DNR, this is again a straddling community application, only needs the local governor's approval. The DNR approves the Foxconn application in April of last year, and a month later, Midwest Environmental Advocates files litigation challenging the Foxconn decision on behalf of the League of Women Voters and several environmental organizations. The key question, well, first I'll show you this just a little bit of a locator map since we're a ways away. So you can see in the lower right-hand corner in the map, we've got Milwaukee to the north and Chicago to the south, and then that pull-out area here with Racine, Mount Pleasant, and then the Foxconn corporate campus is in blue, and then the Great Lakes Basin line again cutting through the corporate campus. So the key issue in the litigation was that the compact says diversions must be for public water supply purposes, and it defines public water supply purposes as serving a group of largely residential customers that may also serve industrial, commercial, and other institutional operators. So to boil it down, the key question in the litigation was, is the Foxconn Racine water diversion application largely residential? At first blush, you would say no, but as again, this erupted as I was just finishing my manuscript, so I have a section on Foxconn in the book, and the authors of the compact that I interviewed, and have been interviewing for years, disagreed about what that language meant. So it's like the drafters of the Constitution disagreeing about what a constitutional amendment or clause might mean. Some said residential referred to the community that's delivering the water, and that the vast majority of the customers need to be residential from there, and that would be Racine, and the vast majority of Racine's customers are residential. Others said, no way, this is all about industrial, and this is not what the compact was meant to do. So, crucial legal difference. The case kicks around for a year, and then this summer, June or so, a judge ruled in favor of the Wisconsin DNR approval of the Racine Foxconn water diversion, but yet another water diversion controversy and test case for the Great Lakes Compact. So, if this map really, this is the yellow here showing the metro area, not the watershed line, but this is that area from the original map that showed where the watershed line is very close to the shoreline. This sort of so-called Chicago, Milwaukee megacity is where all the action is right now with water tension in the Great Lakes region. The Chicago diversion is there, the largest, most controversial. Southeast Wisconsin now has more water diversion hotspots than all the other Great Lakes states combined. We will see more water diversion proposals from this area in the future, in my opinion. And again, this is really where we could call the front line in the Great Lakes water war, if you will. So, overall take-home points here. The compact is working as expected. Litigation was expected. Controversy was expected from the beginning. It's a natural part of the process. The fact is the lakes have never been better protected from long-range, large-scale diversions thanks to the compact. In this world where there's so much doom and gloom about the environment, the compact really stands out as a success story. Again, multi-jurisdictional, multi-party, bipartisan proposal that was actually brought to fruition. Nevertheless, unsustainable water practices in other parts of the world will require that the Great Lakes region be vigilant and always keep its eyes open for potential challenges or loopholes. And then, as I said, Southeast Wisconsin has become the new front line in the Great Lakes water diversion debate. And also, as I said, more return flow water diversions, don't forget, are expected probably fairly soon in southeastern Wisconsin. But thanks to years of bipartisan regional groundwork, we have the system in place to protect this globally significant resource as we enter a period of increasing international water insecurity. So really a great story for the Great Lakes region, and Minnesota was a big part of that. So that's all I have. Super attentive audience. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, here's the first question. As a journalist, what advice in regards to communicating water science and programs can you offer this room full of professionals? What will stick in water communications with audiences?
Yeah, I give talks on this a lot. I gave a talk at IAGLR, International Association of Great Lakes Researchers, on this. I've been in this space for a long time. When I was at Notre Dame, one of my jobs was helping really smart people boil down their life's work into a couple of paragraphs, which is hard for everybody. And this is a constant battle, right? I mean, those of us in the journalism world, we're required to simplify. Otherwise, people won't read our work. We have this era of too long to read now, and so there's all this pressure to make it even shorter and simpler, and that's tough for scientists and people who believe in science and depend on science and write about science. So this is just a constant struggle. It's because we have to simplify on the journalism side, and the scientists are sort of anti-simplicity, right? They want to get down and dirty and really get to the heart of the matter, and it's hard for scientists to simplify. But if you don't help the journalist simplify, then you're delegating that role to a non-specialist in your area. And so it's really important to work ahead and come up with 3 key points that are repeated 3 times, no matter what the questions are. Watch it on the news all the time. Someone asks a question, different answers come, because those are the 3 key talking points. The journalist can ask the question again if they want to come, but you come with your 3 points, try to repeat them 3 times. Redundancy is good in communication. And as brutal as it is to simplify, I mean, this is like the classic scenario, right? Journalist calls up a scientist and says, "Hi, I'm on deadline. Can you boil down your life's work into 1 quote?" Doesn't go over very well. But again, that's the journalist's job. So you need to do that. So Nancy Barron has a great book that talks about this, Escaping the Ivory Tower, talks about creating a message box, which is another word for talking points. Those scientists out there who aren't familiar with her work, I highly recommend it. So really important question, really important in this era that we continue to successfully translate science so that policymakers can use it in their decision making.
Great, thank you. Next question. Is there an expiration to the compact?
There is not. Nope, perpetuity.
That was a short question and a short answer. Good. What else do we have? Have there been any efforts to restore the Aral Sea, diverting water back to it?
Yeah, there have. So, we had Kazakhstan on the north side and Uzbekistan on the south side. And the Aral Sea, we won't go back to the picture, but there's sort of a smaller section on the Kazakh side, and then the big section, it's called the large Aral, small Aral today. And so there's sort of a natural sand and gravel bar there. And so the Kazakhs built a dam there, and they have been restoring the small or North Aral Sea quite successfully. Remarkable how ecosystems can actually bounce back from that much mayhem. And there's a fishery, actually it's a walleye type species that they're selling to restaurants in the EU. But by putting that dam there, they have punted on the broader Aral Sea ecosystem, much to the dismay of Uzbekistan, which has fewer resources and the bigger part of the problem. So it's sort of a mixed story when it comes to the Aral Sea's restoration. Amazing place to visit.
Interesting. What lessons learned on the Great Lakes could we apply to the Mississippi, Minnesota, and Red River basins, where many of us here in the room do our work?
Yeah, that's another really great question. So the Great Lakes, just 8 states, right? You've got 32 or so in the Mississippi River watershed. So it was tough to get 8 states together to create a compact. But in D.C., the Great Lakes region is known as a region that really has its act together, regularly speaks in one bipartisan voice, et cetera, et cetera. The challenges for a system as massive as the Mississippi is you have a lot more states with a lot less in common culturally. And so, but that doesn't mean it can't be done or couldn't be done in sections, et cetera. But the Mississippi River watershed is not well organized, is not cohesive when it comes to things like Asian carp and their advances or other invasive species, et cetera. Just to give one example, water quality issues, the dead zone of Gulf of Mexico, which I've written about over the years. Another example where there could be better coordination. And it starts on the political side. You got to get that buy-in from the political side. They need the input, obviously, from the science side, and it just takes tons of patience. But I think that's to try and get that geographic, even in pieces. You could have the Upper Mississippi kind of compact kind of organization, and then the Central and Southern or whatever. But it's big. It's a big lift because of the size of the watershed, but it can definitely help. It can help with funding, can help with scientific coordination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but it's tricky because the watershed's so big.
All right, thank you. And I see that now we've come to the end of our scheduled time. It's 1 o'clock. So we'll close this part of the session down. I know that Peter will be around for at least for a little while, and you could ask him perhaps additional questions out there by the books. And in case you want to buy one again, they're for sale out there. The next session starts at 1:15. Let's thank Peter one more time.